Hello, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural first episode of Techno Trek Tuesdays. I'm joined with Brandon Yan and Brian White. My name, of course, is Menel Yunus. I'll be your host today while we discuss some of the ideas that we've been putting together for you. I'd like to welcome you to Trekker's Delight, of course. This is under the main umbrella of that show, the show that celebrates the amazing world of Star Trek. And specifically today, we're going to be discussing matter antimatter reactions. They're here to provide their expertise, to answer questions, to tell their story, and provide opinions on how and why that within the Star Trek world is important to talk about pulling out the technology and how it's important and profound to us as human beings. Hi, Brandon. Hi, Brian. Thank you for joining us today. How are you guys doing?
Doing pretty good. Thanks for inviting us in.
Oh, can't complain. Wouldn't do any good anyhow, right?
So, just to get us started, we're talking about, or we've had a conversation about what is matter, what is antimatter, and why it's important within the feature of Star Trek. Why why hasn't this come into the real world? Why aren't we using matter antimatter reactions yet? Brandon, why don't we use antimatter matter reactions yet?
Well, in my personal humble opinion, it's a matter of the technology not being developed to a widespread use as of yet. The concept and the theory is viable, and it can and has some practical applications, which we'll talk about later. But the reality is, it's just not quite as easily distributable as and feasible as current fossil fuels or nuclear reaction at this time. The science isn't developed to the point where it can replace current level of technology. I mean,
Mm-mm.
that's the modern theory. I disagree with that. I think we're far more advanced than that, but that's conspiracy land. So.
Brian, what's your take?
Yeah, basically we like right now we can actually produce antimatter, but not in sufficient enough quantities to actually, do anything with it. Plus, we can't there's no way to contain it. So essentially if we do create it, we have no way to store it. So it basically just kind of goes to waste. And there are some practical applications, as Brandon said, but it's way too expensive to produce in any quantity, and ultimately just not practical at our current level of technology.
Mm. So what I'm hearing is that obviously it's we're talking about something very future forward, and we're sort of flirting with trapping it, capturing it, using the energy. Um, we discussed three different problems, really, that are involved with them. Brandon, if you could you delineate on the three big problems that you see?
Well, the three major problems that we have with antimatter are, creating or generating it. The amount of power, the amount of technology involved, the amount of research involved, and the amount of just overall, the issues with generating and gathering it. Then we're talking about containment because, as it is widely known, anytime matter and antimatter come in contact with each other, they annihilate each other, whether they release pulses
Hmm.
of energy or explosions or whatever. There's an instantaneous annihilation. So keeping them separated, keeping it contained, that's a big issue. And then harnessing the energy from it, being able to siphon off either the power in an energy form or a frequency form or heat transfer or anything like that. We haven't quite mastered that yet. So those are the three major issues that we have with antimatter at this point.
That's cool. I mean, just thinking about it, the fact that you have these enormous amounts of energy um, that are required to move a starship, right? One of the things that we discussed was the two types of energy systems. So you had the sublight system,
Hmm.
maybe that involves the deflectors, the Broussard collectors, and then you had the main. warp core. So can you tell us the differences? I remember you mentioned the differences between those technologies.
Well, it boils down to a few basic things. The impulse drive is fusion based. That's seen on numerous episodes, technical manuals, everything else. It's a hybridization of cold fusion and hot fusion. That's for a later topic because that's
Mm,
still something else. But impulse drive, which is sublight, which can go up to I believe 0.33 C, which is
wow,
one third the speed of light.
right.
Technically, 0.29 C is the standard impulse speed of full
That's
impulse.
really fast.
It really is. It's pretty quick. So when you see a ship flying through the scene, it actually makes sense that you're going to cross, you know, a great distance in a short amount of time.
Yeah, especially compared to what we can do right now. Yeah.
Exactly. But that's all fusion based. That's used with a mix of deuterium and deuterium fusion and some other types of particle manipulation and stuff like that. That's all sublight. Then we're talking about, warp drive, which is what antimatter is used for. Now, the sublight system also includes your auxiliary power generation, again, fusion reactors strewn about the ship. However, if you were to combine all the fusion generators on any given starship, just to use example the Enterprise D, it's a massive ship. It's a huge ship, but all the fusion generators on board, even running at max capacity, do not have the ability to put out even 1/10 of the power of a matter antimatter reactor on the ship. The primary power source on the ship is the warp core. The matter
Mm,
antimatter reactor, you know, it puts out an enormous amount of power that powers everything from the shields to the plasma system that powers the warp drive that allows the warp coils to generate the field that allows the ship to travel through subspace,
Yep. Onboard computer system.
onboard computer systems, weapons.
Hmm.
The deflector grid, the entire shield array, the plasma network for the phaser array.
Life support. Yeah.
Basically, everything that is a primary system is run off the matter antimatter reactor, which is in main
wow.
engineering of every ship. So that's the two different real types of power. You got fusion and you got matter antimatter.
Interesting. Is the fusion power okay? What I'm interested in the question is there a capacitance? So let's talk about battery. Is there a space? The EPS manifold, right, is what runs through, but and there are EPS taps.
Hmm.
Correct.
Are there collectors? Are there things that are
There
collecting them?
are a series of batteries on every single ship,
Hmm.
and they're cerium chrolide battery cells. They're designed in such a way that they themselves, with limited power input, can actually regenerate and store their own power.
Hmm.
Mm,
That power system is used to initiate fusion on the reactors for the fusion systems. The fusion systems then actually power the initial reaction system for the matter antimatter chamber.
hmm.
So it's a
Brian.
chain reaction.
Yeah. Also, the way that I've seen it laid out on certain ships is you have a certain number of decks that are run off of a series of those batteries, when under emergency power or, when they need a little extra power here and there. Um, and you have several of arrays of these batteries all throughout the ship. So, uh, you know, one of the things that Starfleet uh, deals with is like triple redundancy,
Yep.
backups on
Yes,
backups
yes.
on
Backups on
backups.
backups. The redundancy of backups. Yeah.
Thank you,
Well,
Chief Miles Edward O'Brien.
I
right?
know. Remember we argued with that Cardassian lady? That wasn't what we wanted.
But basically, there are several arrays of these batteries stationed all throughout the ship,
Mm,
and there are several decks that run off of at least one of these arrays. Um,
interesting.
at any given time that it's needed, whenever they have to use emergency power or whenever they have to reroute, you know, extra power that they can't pull from the warp core for whatever reason, because
Right.
we all know that they use the warp core for everything. Well, sometimes there's just no more energy that they can safely pull from the warp core without pulling that from another subsystem. Well, sometimes
Interesting.
they'll pull from the batteries backups, to supplement what they already have.
Yep.
Um,
Case in point, when Voyager was going through the what episode was it? I believe it's called Scientific Method, where they're going through the binary pulsar
mm,
because of the aliens that were attacking them. Janeway literally put everything she had into the engines just so they could push through. That
right.
includes the battery system, the fusion system, the auxiliary fusion system, the warp
Everything
core,
except life
everything
support.
that
Yeah.
they've got. No, even life support.
Oh
She
yeah. Yeah.
diverted life support into that
Yeah.
just to make sure they got through. So we're talking every ounce of power on that ship.
It's a lot of power.
Oh yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
amazing this thing doesn't blow itself apart. I think that some of the power is actually set aside to buffet some of that. I think some of it is siphoned off to make like energy fields that like the deflector array or something
Correct.
that is like create there's just something there to make sure that none of this has a feedback into the bulkheads and actual other systems, because you're playing with such huge amounts of transfers of power, not just the power there, but the
Hmm.
transfers of power. You know what I'm
Correct.
Right.
saying? Yeah, that's just something that occurs to me. Now, something else that I want to bring up, and I want to speak specifically to both of you about it, but Brandon in particular, was the problems and utilization of antimatter. So, if I can bring you up, Brandon, and just ask you about some of the actual ability for us to use antimatter in the real world. What are some of the things holding us back?
Well, for current technology, utilizing antimatter in the real world, there are theories of how to use it, and then there's practical applications. As of right now, the practical applications that have been tested are for medical use, actually,
Hmm.
because certain types of well,
Positron emission tomography.
positrons and neutrons and all that kind of stuff are used in more modern cancer research to
Mm-hmm.
target specific cancer cells to eradicate it. So that is a modern use of antimatter because it can actually pass through certain types of tissue at a certain frequency,
Hmm.
collide with what it needs to, annihilate it, release the energy pulse that it needs to do, and that'll eradicate what it needs to target. So there's some practical applications there. There's been tests of matter collision and energy release, and trying to capture that energy. Those have not been very successful recently, just because it's one of those things where it's just really hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
Containing antimatter. Right now, we have about a 16-minute time frame that's known, and it's literally within an electromagnetic field, and that
Mm-hmm.
field has to take an immense amount of energy just to keep it contained.
Yes.
And once that containment is lost, the antimatter annihilates itself against the matter of the container, and
Yeah.
it's gone.
Right.
So our biggest issues, literally right now, are containment and strategic use of it. Generating it, there's a lot of different ways of generating antimatter. You've got lightning, which
Hmm.
actually generates,
Not naturally. Yeah.
natural. There is natural occurring antimatter actually in the atmosphere on the super high levels of the atmosphere,
Hmm.
right
The Van
before
Allen
you
belt.
hit that,
Yeah.
the exosphere. But collecting it, it's cool. It's there. Great. Fantastic. Can we do anything with it? No. We can't take it anywhere. We can't maneuver it. We can't, it's just not possible for us to harvest it. I love the Bassard collectors in Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
They just suck it in like a vacuum cleaner.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic idea.
Oh yeah.
Can we do that now? No, not at all. We can create it using the Hadron Colliders.
Hmm.
I think
Once
that
it's
there is
made,
something there with how they create their own antimatter.
yeah.
Even though they can collect it, it's very difficult to catch antimatter in the wild. If they have some method of like, I don't know. I kind of want to bring it back to what you said about the antimatter pods, Brian. The antimatter pods and their there's stuff that you eject into outer space with the
Right.
one-time use. What is with that?
I was watching a YouTube video where the individual was describing the deck layout of Voyager, and he came up to a particular portion, which is the antimatter pod storage compartment, and they also had an antimatter pod ejection system for when they use all of the antimatter in the pod, they can just jettison the pod itself to make room for whatever else. But there was one episode in particular that I was watching of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where the antimatter containment unit was being breached, and basically they said if it gets down to like 15%, the antimatter containment would breach, and there would be a massive explosion, etc. But
What are your theories on that? What are your thoughts? Why would that happen? And I want to hear
well,
from Brandon as well next on that theory.
as far as I can tell, the antimatter containment keeps the antimatter from reacting with the surrounding matter, and because it's being stored in such large quantities, it's not like what we can produce today, where
Mm,
it basically the antimatter, once it's destroyed or released or whatever, basically the energy that it produces, I've heard it said, isn't even enough to boil a cup of tea. So it's
right.
not a
Yeah.
lot.
It
But
powers a light bulb for 3 minutes.
right, but basically, like antimatter in such large quantities like that, if the antimatter containment were to breach, that would be like a catastrophic antimatter explosion, and you know,
Two points I would bring up. One is the coolant, and two is the constrictor. But I want
mhm,
to throw to Brandon real quick because I want to hear his thoughts on that.
right.
Well, the episode I believe is called Disaster,
Mm.
and it's the
Where
one
Troy gets
where
her first
Troy gets
taste of
her.
command. Yeah.
Well, kind of, sort of. She basically, her and O'Brien are talking on the bridge, and they literally have to reroute a certain amount of power to keep that containment up,
Hmm.
and it's a fight to keep that there because they're not sure what's going on, and they have to get someone who's in engineering to actually divert that power. Now,
Exactly.
as we know, to generate an electromagnetic field of any kind, it requires a fairly large, sizable quantity of power. Shoot, you're at a wrecking yard, you have that giant electromagnetic, crane that sucks the cars up and drops them.
Exactly.
That isn't something you can plug into a 9-volt battery. That's something that you have to plug into the main system of your scrap yard
Hmm.
and run it straight from the powerhouse, from the mains. So the electromagnetic constriction system and the containment vessel for the antimatter pods takes a significant amount of energy.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And this was about to breach because the fusion system was down. They were running on
Hmm.
emergency backup power, which, as Brian said, we're talking backups of backups of backups. This is the case where Starfleet's redundancy actually paid off
Yeah.
for long enough to actually get them through something.
Exactly.
So at the very tail end, they were able to get a notice to engineering, and I believe it was it Riker that
Riker
saw it?
and
Riker and
the
Data,
head of Commander Data.
yeah, was able to actually divert the right amount of power, but it was because the power was draining. They didn't have enough energy to maintain the magnetic constriction in the vessels, and
Interesting.
we're not talking about one antimatter pod. We're talking a chain of between 20 and 30 antimatter pods on the Enterprise D. There's probably 20 on Voyager. I think there's 10 on the Defiant, so on and so forth. So we're talking a very large, we're talking a massive amount of power per pod, and then we're talking chains of these pods.
Hmm.
So, and the two options were restore power or eject the pods into space. That was,
Actually, I believe the second option was separate the saucer section and GTFO, but according to
yeah, but they should have
according to
done the
Ensign Rowe, yeah.
Yeah, but they should have done the antimatter eject. Anyway,
Agreed. Agreed. That's
flaw in
usually
the
the better.
writing.
That's usually the better option, but I don't think they could have. I don't think they could access that system, which is one of the
It
reasons
could be.
why that
Maybe the
wasn't an
ejection
option at that
system was
time.
offline like it normally is on every ship
Uh,
all the time.
from my understanding, the bridge was entirely cut off from the rest of the ship by the emergency bulkhead system
Yeah,
because they had
you're right.
multiple hull breaches, et cetera, et cetera. So
Correct.
it was essentially
Yeah, they couldn't get there to do anything with it, even if they wanted
Right,
to.
right.
right. Not
Yeah.
to mention the bridge systems were also cut off. The only way they could actually get anybody to respond is to turn the transfer enough power to the engineering monitors to get somebody's attention. Um,
Very cool.
but yeah, basically, it was definitely one of those make some stuff up kind of deals.
Love it. Okay, so one last bit that I want to talk about is the application of antimatter, Star Trek's application. So it's used in photon and quantum torpedoes, power
Mm-hmm.
generation, and there's some kind of antimatter generator.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and this is something that has always thrilled me, and I'm very grateful to Rick Sternbach and his writing that he did back on the original tech manual. But according to the technical manuals, the Enterprise D had an antimatter generator that was located on Deck 42. It was fairly sizable. It was basically a microhydrogen collider, and it would collide the particles together and manipulate the matter, which was deuterium,
Mm-hmm.
such a way that it would transform the deuterium into antimatter and then move it through a series of conduits into a pod. Now, the amount of
Fascinating.
power necessary for this was extreme, and it was only supposed to be used during times of dire emergency where the Bassard collectors weren't collecting anything and there was no, resupply vessel or starbase nearby. And I believe there was an episode, I think it's the one with the Traveler, where they're thrown out way across space. Where I remember someone saying in a passing comment, I think, that we're not going to have enough antimatter to get home.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And that's a very significant comment because the Enterprise D was a self sustaining starship. And if it's not going to have enough antimatter to get home, we're
Right,
talking about a ship that can collect it and generate it, and it didn't have enough to get home. So that
right,
kind of tells you how critical the antimatter system is to the ship,
right.
which, you know,
And
if it's
and
used for everything,
and that kind of also brings me back to Voyager as well, because Voyager, I'm assuming, has a lot of the same systems involved, but unfortunately they didn't have enough to get home, so they had to search for more dilithium and deuterium and other means of fuel to get home. um,
I,
and if memory serves, there was another ship in the Delta Quadrant who did not have those capabilities, who had to resort to, say, other means to generate
genocide of an
energy.
alien race,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
The
Which
Equinox.
which goes against everything Starfleet stands for. But when you're all the
Absolutely.
way out in the Delta Quadrant and you have practically no hope of getting home, some people resort to, shall we say, drastic measures to get things done.
ransom. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
but
Captain Ransom.
I mean, fascinating. Getting your ship up to those speeds,
mhm.
right? Like we're really unclear kind of on what warp is anyway, and what those, if we have Mach, right, and we have warp, and there's different theories on what warp is and how many versions of light speed it actually is versus like what we can actually do in real life. So,
Ludicrous
um,
speed, go!
yeah, exactly. So
uh,
it's great. I'm glad to have this conversation, to be honest, because I think it's one of those key things that people are like, okay, can we do this, and can it be used, for instance, in gravity manipulation? Brian, we discussed
Oops.
briefly about. I just hit my computer. We discussed like artificial gravity generation and like
right,
would
uh,
would gravity, like you have artificial gravity generation, but
right.
then doesn't won't this interact with the antimatter containment units?
Right.
Like,
It's
how do
been
these things?
said that in order to generate a containment field of a sufficient amount to actually contain antimatter, you have to keep it in a essentially a null gravity. You have to keep it from moving.
Bingo.
So my question was basically, since you have artificial gravity everywhere else in the ship, you have the gravity plating on the deck floor, on the deck flooring, and everywhere else in the ship, would you still have artificial gravity in the antimatter storage pod, in the antimatter storage containment room?
One of the
Or
interesting
would it
points
have its own
was,
self-contained
yeah,
gravity system inside each pod
one of the
to
interesting things
regulate the
from the
antimatter?
top 10 article that we read was, would antimatter fall up?
You're right.
Is it
Um,
actually affected by gravity in a different way than regular particles? Which is an interesting idea. But like, given that, if that is the case, then if you're naturally or artificially creating certain gravitational fields, the fields would of course interact.
Yep.
So yeah, would it have to be in a space that is like away from those fields? Sorry, Brandon, go ahead.
No, it absolutely would. And actually, one of the things that is talked about in the technical manuals, which I love, again, Doug Drexler, genius, love the guy,
mhm.
um, is actually that because of the artificial gravity system and the way it's designed in the Star Trek universe, you can actually turn off one section of gravity generator depending on where you're at. It's not an
Mhm.
all on or an all off situation. It's not a light
Wouldn't that
switch.
wouldn't that
Like,
lend itself to Brian's theory about the segregation of the sublight power systems, the fusion systems? Sorry, Brian, go ahead.
No, you're 100% correct. It actually would, and one the artificial gravity system is actually fairly independent of itself, but it runs off the fusion network.
brings me back to the one episode of Deep Space Nine where you had the Starfleet officer who was from the world where gravity is so low you can fly
Hmm.
through the air. Well, she had to have her own
Laura.
independent gravity
Right.
inside her quarters to be able to
Yep.
relax and so on and so forth. So we all know that each individual room has its own gravity plating
They
and
had to set it up. I think there
variable.
was
Yeah,
something where they took it off the. Yeah, there was some
right,
engineering stuff there
Yeah,
for
they
her.
disconnected it from the main series,
Yes,
right,
but
yes.
it was still. I mean, shoot, it's artificial gravity, so yeah, you can,
exactly.
as long as you segregate it out, you can have any kind of manipulation you need. So
Yeah.
having it in the antimatter pods, I think you might have it in walkway areas,
Hmm.
but I think around the pods themselves, I think that they would have that deactivated unless it's in a maintenance facility.
Yeah, but like I
Hmm.
said, I'm actually wondering if each antimatter storage pod didn't have its own independent uh, gravity system installed to regulate the antimatter containment,
That's
because
actually an
it
interesting idea.
it would stand to reason that each individual pod would have to regulate the antimatter inside of it.
Yes, yes.
Yep, absolutely.
So
It
I
would be
would
a form
think
of a micro antimatter trap or
exactly.
micro magnetic constrictor.
Exactly. So I would imagine that you would have to, have an individual gravity, anti gravity system set up inside for the containment of the antimatter.
Which
Otherwise,
probably goes to show
boom.
why antimatter injectors are so sought after and why
Mhm.
everyone was like, oh, they make. There was a couple episodes, even in Voyager, where like we need those injectors, like, or in
Yep.
Enterprise, we need
Yep.
those injectors. No one
Yeah.
else makes them this good because you can't risk it. You
Yeah.
have to,
Exactly.
and
And of course, Starfleet specs are, kind of ridiculous, but I mean, they're that way for a reason because once again, triple redundancy.
Exactly.
You have to make sure they're of
Uh,
sufficient quality that they're going to last a while. And if they don't, you want to make sure
speaking
you have backups.
speaking of quality, and I'll throw myself up here.
Hmm.
Uh, we briefly discussed a 1985 paper that discussed dilithium, and we can get into it in another time. I'm really just touching on all of these things for
mhm.
our audience so they can like see where our conversation went.
Hmm.
A type of crystal matrix which actually could be used as a coating, as a thermal dissipating, a fast dissipating material, metamaterial that I think that this paper definitely was looked at by the TNG staff or something. But
Oh yeah,
B
it
is
had to be.
a self-sustaining and a self generating a reactive core or matrix,
Mhm.
as Brandon put it, that could be regrown, recrystallized, that could be used to coat the and could be used to absorb the actual reaction of the actual antimatter. One of the things is not just the thermal energy, but there's like neutrinos, which I think that the TNG world is sophisticated enough that the neutrinos aren't just massless, but that they're somehow captured or moved so that they can maybe affect neutrons, and maybe they can be used to actually regenerate part of their antimatter stream. My theory, because of just how that's just something that I think of. And then
Yeah.
B, this metamaterial, which is I think actually goes to the core of how do you make like a dilithium. I'm going to throw Brandon up so he can expound a little more on this.
Well, the I read an article a long time ago, back when I was in my teens, and I uh, I wrote a couple papers on it for high school and whatnot, and it was interesting to
Wow.
me anyway. But it was about how there's certain types of quartz crystals, and when they first started dabbling with the theory of antimatter, we always wondered what is dilithium crystal? Where did it come from? What's the concept? Well, one of the things that we looked at in this article is that there's a certain type of quartz crystal called a disilicide quartz, and it's a really complex quartz crystal,
Hmm.
and it has the ability to regenerate itself and regrow itself. I mean, it's a crystal, so it's going to grow, but it has
Mm.
the ability to regrow itself. Now, if you were to have this disilicide quartz and grow it inside of a lithium filament uh, matrix or a lithium filament lattice framework,
Yeah.
give it something to grow around.
Right. A
And then you
scaffold.
use that as your coating to surround the inside of a reaction chamber that you can annihilate the molecules of matter and antimatter.
Hmm.
You would not only get the thermal properties of the disilicide quartz, but you'd get the power absorption of the lithium. What are most
Yes,
batteries made out of nowadays? Lithium.
that's
And,
right.
and
Lithium
here's the
ion
interesting
power
thing:
cells. Yeah.
a disilicide quartz with a lithium framework. What do you call that?
Dilithium.
Crystal. I just, and I read that article a long time ago, and I can't find the original article, and I can't find my papers on it, but it stuck in my head so much. I'm just like, I know what this is, and we found this article that we were looking at that talks about the
Hmm.
disilicide quartz and its thermal reactive, not reactive, but thermal absorption and dissipation properties, regrowth properties, and its thermal barrier. And that right there, you throw that with the lithium, that's what we're talking about.
Mm.
There's your reaction chamber. There's your power absorption.
Yeah.
Now I want to see it put into practice. that's what,
And
that's what's exciting to me. It's like, why isn't
and
this done yet?
and in that article, it's actually interesting to note that there is an image of one of the unit cells, is what it's called, of the crystals formation, and it looks remarkably like
Mm. Figure
the
three.
uh, the articulation frame of a dilithium matrix.
Yep.
Which I'm going to say is probably an inspiration. I think that this was in the
Oh,
atmosphere.
guaranteed.
You have scientific papers, and
Oh
I
yeah.
remember in one of the documentaries them going into deep dives into these types of technologies. So a lot of the TNG technology was based on real world theoretical physics at the
Hmm.
time. So I
Exactly.
would say that that is definitely, even though it's not, like they say in Iron Man, this is the technology of my day. It does not reach like where I want to be, but their ideas are possible. Not only that, but now they're probable.
Oh,
We have
absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Tell me about that. Do you think
We
it's
know what
probable?
antimatter is.
Hmm.
We know that we can contain it using both electromagnetic fields and something that you proposed the other day when we were talking is the sonic fields,
Yep.
because
Yes.
it has the ability to sound waves have the ability to create a pressure vacuum, basically a
Hmm.
pressure
Yes.
form. And if we can create a pressure form, antimatter is harnessable. So
Yes.
that is possible. Now, here's the thing: antimatter does not disappear on its own. It doesn't have a decay rate. It doesn't have a half life. It exists until It's
It's
annihilated by a
annihilated.
particle of
Yeah,
matter.
it
So if we
exists
can
until
find
it
a
doesn't.
proper way of containing it, we can have antimatter reserves.
Hmm.
Therefore, yes, it is something that we can potentially, if we get the right containment together, we can start harnessing antimatter. We can start transporting antimatter. And we can start putting it to use for humanity. I would
Hmm.
love to see a series of matter antimatter reactors built all over the planet to replace everything other than nuclear and hydroelectric. Because, you know, granted,
It's
I'm not a.
inefficient.
It's
Right.
so much more power efficient,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Yeah.
you can use the reaction power to power the colliders necessary to make more antimatter.
Hmm.
It's
Put it, it turns it into a perpetual motion machine for all intents and
yeah, yeah,
purposes.
yeah. We would basically
And
have free energy.
Yep.
exactly, we would have free energy. Thank you, Nikola Tesla.
Right.
But I believe that that possibility is out there. I think we might be. I wouldn't say 10 years, but I'd say I think we're about 50 years away, which basically puts us
Yeah.
100 years past Star Trek's inception date
Of
for
course, that
matter
also
antimatter
depends
technology.
on our world leaders and also,
Yeah, if you
the
eliminate
people with the
greed,
money. Yeah,
if
the
you
people with
eliminate
the
greed
money.
from the
Exactly.
planet, we're about 50 years away of just R&D technology being able to
Right.
get this up and running. And if we
Exactly.
do that, we're literally 100 years from the inception date of Star Trek talking about antimatter reactors in the original series
Hmm.
to being practical use. Now, will that power starships in our day? I won't live to see that.
Well, maybe,
Will
maybe
You know,
not.
we
my
never know. There are,
grandkids?
yeah.
Maybe I almost guarantee you. Will my
They might turn
grandkids
you
live
into
to
a
see
robot,
that?
Brandon. They might turn you into a robot.
Oh, please don't Picard me.
You get that?
But no, I truthfully believe that if we eliminate greed from the issue
Mm,
and we apply science and physics and practicality to this, we could have matter antimatter technology within 50 years.
Well, I mean,
uh,
not even just science and technology and everything like that, but just common sense in general.
True. So
I
true.
mean, if our world leaders can get their head out of their butts long enough to see that we're in trouble, I mean, our fossil
Everybody wants
fuels,
green energy. Here's
yeah,
your green energy.
yeah, our fossil fuels are dwindling, and we have all these other problems. But unfortunately, the politicians and the world leaders that are in charge can't pull their heads out of their butts long enough to see the problem for what it is. And that's a story for another
That's a
time.
topic for another time.
it's
But
okay.
long story short, I mean, like you said, once we eliminate the greed and the politics and all this other stuff, what we're left with is pure science and pure technology, and maybe a little common sense to go around. And
I believe
then,
it's possible. I mean, I
yeah,
believe
I do too.
humanity, if we keep on the path scientifically that we're going with this kind of level of technology, yeah, we're gonna have matter antimatter reaction.
Yeah,
We're
but
gonna
like
be
you
able
said, I
to
mean,
reach other planets and other stars very quickly and very easily.
yeah,
Just
but
just to throw this out there, some of the research I've done, we can create gravitons.
mhm.
I'll have to
Really?
find my paperwork on that. But to create a
Okay.
graviton, it takes a massive amount of power, which would require a matter antimatter reactor
Mhm.
to create a
Yeah,
Um,
we are.
graviton.
Once we get to the point where we're making matter and antimatter reactions and like successfully and contained and stuff, then you start to have more high level physics of stuff that's possible.
Oh,
mhm.
Black
absolutely,
holes,
absolutely.
wormholes,
Shoot,
even pushing
White
stars and planets
holes.
around.
Yeah.
Yeah,
gravity drives.
gravity
Mhm.
drive, something that, and
Boom.
that's where you can
There we
get
go.
artificial. You're like, how much power does this take? Like the actual level of power that requires these types of things to happen. So
Mhm.
I
Technology
will.
level up.
Thank you, boys. I'm gonna wrap this up. I'm just gonna like leave you guys with a few final thoughts. Brian, anything else you want to leave on?
Well, I was going to say that with our current level of green technology, with the exception of nuclear and hydroelectric, as Brandon said, um, unfortunately, like wind and solar power don't produce enough energy in sufficient quantities to power, you know, hardly anything.
They really don't.
Like wind farms are essentially a gimmick at this point. Yeah, you can power a small area with a wind farm, but
If the
not
wind doesn't blow,
realistically.
you don't get power.
Right, and it's the same thing with solar energy. If the sun's not shining, or if you have a whole bunch of cloud cover, you're not going to generate enough power to actually run your house or
We
anything like that on.
we do have technology that overcomes that. Have you ever seen
Oh
those
yeah,
things that lift those giant cement blocks? We turn it into potential energy and then we release it slowly. There are things that
Oh yeah,
overcome. So yeah,
right,
absolutely.
it's like
But
stacking.
if we're
yeah,
talking about pure green energy, matter antimatter is the way to go.
yep.
Okay, then I'll throw to Brandon with your final thoughts.
That's actually my final thought. We want green energy, matter antimatter reaction. I mean,
Hmm.
we have the potential for the technology. I think it just needs to be developed. I think we need to focus on that. Don't worry about. I mean, solar's great, wind is great. Oceanic currents. I think that
Yep.
kind of technology for movement ratio and, like you
Right.
said, the movement motion stuff is great for kinetic motion. Fantastic, great energy generation. However, if we want real energy that's going to be natural, perpetual, that's not going to use a resource that we don't have, matter antimatter.
Hmm.
The whole
Okay,
universe is made of matter, and the whole universe is made of energy.
that's
Yep.
true.
Why not use the universe as our power source?
I love it.
Hmm.
Thanks so much for joining me, guys. I'm just going to sign off here by having our audience. Please, I just want to thank you for listening to us today on Techno Trek Tuesdays with on Trekker's Delight. Please check it out. Before you go, show us some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review in the comments. Let us know if you have your own references you'd like to share, or if there's something that we missed. Hit us up. Let us know. Please leave us links in the comments below. Then stay tuned for the next time that we come together. We'll have something spicy for you. Okay,
And don't
gentlemen,
forget to
thank you so
like and
much.
subscribe.
And
Like and
also,
subscribe.
some of the reference materials that we used in this episode today will probably be down in the description below. Don't forget to check that out if you want to do your own research and formulate your own theories.
Absolutely.
More power to
Thanks,
you,
guys.
and we appreciate anything else you can come up with.
Please do. And for topic suggestions, let us know.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. Topic
Yep.
suggestions.
Okay, gentlemen.
All
I'll
right.
see you on the flip.
All right. You have a good one.
Take
Live
care.
long and prosper, everybody.
Live long and prosper.
Peace and long life.